So in 2010, an 8.8 earthquake struck Chile, not far from Santiago. And for those who were fans of his, they got sort of a bird's eye view from Elliot Yamin. And Elliot Yamin is a singer who rose to popularity in the show American Idol. And Elliot Yamin sort of described sort of this point-by-point devastation that was occurring in the hotel where he was staying. He had recently done a festival in one of the sort of rural hinterlands not far from Santiago. But as part of this sort of point-by-point Twitter that he was sort of exposing people in America about the disaster, he also told them that he was fearful because he was suffering from type 1 diabetes, and he only had enough in his insulin pump to last until Sunday. It was Saturday. He was scheduled to leave the next day, and what they were telling him is that there are not going to be any outgoing flights until at least Thursday or Friday. So he tweeted, other people tweeted, he got into contact with the American Embassy, and ultimately he was able to get an insulin pump by that Tuesday, which raises these interesting questions about who else needed an insulin pump in Chile during the disaster, right? So in 2010, roughly 9.5% of the adult population between 20 and 79 suffered from diabetes. And so this equated to about 1.4, 1.5 million people. And how did you do that? I'm sorry. Okay. So he, as part of his Twitter, sort of wrote that I hope to get home before I slip into a diabetic coma. That would be nice. I'm trying to be positive. I'm alive and well. I have all my limbs attached. I don't know how we got out of there unscathed. I'm very grateful. But this comment was sort of very interesting and for a number of reasons. My research on sort of amputations. He's not necessarily talking about sort of amputated limbs in this particular piece. He's probably talking about saving his limbs from the earthquake. But I'm also sort of thinking about sort of prosthetic limbs and how this is a sort of an epidemic within the diabetes epidemic, and how expensive, prohibitively so, amputations are for Black people in particular. But I'm also sort of thinking about the ways in which, Black people have a hard time, and non-white people generally have a hard time finding prosthetic limbs that match their skin color. So they're forced out of necessity to wear these sort of white limbs on their Black bodies because these sort of darker skin limbs or sort of produced limbs are not sort of produced in adequate fashion. And so what does it mean to have to wear pants in the summertime or stockings in the summertime because of this? And so I build on theories from Ruha Benjamin and Irving Goffman regarding this sort of this idea of race and technology. So these questions then of chronic disease are very important for us. Okay, I got you. So historians have long thought about the aftermath of disasters, right? We, for the most part, think about chronic disease, right? This is an image from my first book on the 1927 flood, in which pellagra, for example, was a significant fear. Pellagra was a B3 niacin deficiency. We don't hear much about pellagra now. It still pops up sometimes in Mississippi and Oklahoma and Louisiana, but it was endemic and epidemic in parts of South Carolina and Mississippi in the early 20th century. And these questions of sort of disease sort of animate much of the scholarship that historians have done in the past 20, 30 years. But part of what I argue is that Katrina, in many ways, sort of reshifted our attention to focus much more on sort of the long-term sort of chronic disease that we need to address in the aftermath of these disasters. So what you'll see here is that I'm going to move a little bit from disaster to disaster, right? So one of the disasters that I've talked about in the past is Princeville. And Princeville is an all-Black town in North Carolina, established by recently freed slaves in 1865. Became incorporated in 1885 as Princeville after one of its main sort of advocates, Richard Turner Prince. And it lies along the Tar River. And the Tar River is 180 miles. It flows completely within the state of North Carolina. And people like my father and sort of locals, where this is sort of the area where my father is from, call it the mighty Tar. He calls it the mighty Tar because, you know, as he would say, if not for the Tar River, a whole lot of poor people would have starved to death in the early 20th century. Because it's a place where people fished and, you know, fished for commerce, but also fished to stave off hunger as well, right? But it's mighty as well because it had an inclination to flood, right? It's sort of a constant flooding threat throughout the 20th century. And it's also a cantankerous river. Every summer you would hear of someone sort of dying in the Tar River. One step it might be 5 feet, the next step it might be 20 feet. With sort of dangerous undercurrents and water moccasins. So as the elders would say, the Tar is not a river to be trifled with. But in 1999, back-to-back hurricanes, Hurricane Dennis and Hurricane Floyd struck the Tar River in eastern North Carolina. Hurricane Dennis brought roughly 6 to 8 inches of rain, and Hurricane Floyd brought an additional 16 to 18 inches of rain upon the already flooded landscape. And so Princeville at this time has a long history of sort of being placed into sort of an environmentally degraded land, but also pressure from business people to sort of resell that land or sell that land because of its prime waterfront property. And so this becomes part of the narrative. Princeville in 1999 had roughly 2,000 residents, 85 individual homes, 40 businesses, and about 3 or 4 churches, one of which had been in existence since the 1870s. But part of the discussion around Princeville, which lies in the eastern part of the state with high incidences of chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, was the fact that Rocky Mount, which was 20 miles upstream, deliberately opened the Tar River Reservoir and unleashed an untold amount of water into the Princeville community. And so this then sort of brought up a number of different sort of scenarios in which Princeville described itself as constantly being under attack from others surrounding them due to their situation or site. 17 years later, when Hurricane Matthew occurs, some of these same tensions continue to sort of elevate and become part of this broader narrative. So part of what I do then as a historian is sort of think about these questions of race and disaster. What Princeville discloses to us and what it illuminates. This is a piece that I wrote in the American Historian magazine, which is sort of one of the flagship magazines of the Organization of American Historians. And so I titled this piece, Making Race Visible in the Disaster Archive, because I'm sort of describing the reasons why I use blues and blues literature. And a lot of people have talked about sort of the archive in the last couple of days. And this was an important part of my first book on the 1927 flood as well. I remember talking to a colleague of mine at Florida State and sort of describing to him that I had never really come across many sources that dealt specifically with the materiality of the flood from the perspective of African Americans. In other words, what did the levee sound like when it broke? What did the water smell like? What were their sort of sensibilities when they saw the water flooding to them? And so sensing my frustration, he said, well, why don't you write about that? And, you know, as a young scholar, I didn't realize that I could actually sort of critique the archive like that. But I do in one of my first chapters, and that becomes sort of part of how I think about this broader narrative of sort of the archive, but also sort of making the case that it was Richard Wright and sort of blues musicians like Charlie Patton who were the first chroniclers in many ways of the flood, of the disaster. And it was through them that sort of I created this narrative of what sort of the Black experience was like in this particular disaster. But I also sort of want to make the case, and this is sort of a point that I think we've missed a little bit throughout the last couple of days, which is, it can be difficult at times to get these kinds of writings and materials through peer review as well, right? So, I get these comments all the time about the archive, like, where are your primary sources on sort of a Black experience during the 1927 flood, right? This is sort of what I would go through in the anonymous peer review process. And, my response would be, well, if I had it, I would give it to you. I'm not trying to hide this information, right? So it's about sort of showing the ways in which there are different ways of knowing, and there are different sort of ideologies that help us to disclose the historical past. One of the other pieces that I talk about, which has been raised in this context a couple of times, is this idea of what counts as a death, right? Why are certain people counted and other people are not counted? And I tell a story in this piece, which is sort of a personal family story. My grandmother, her name was Dorothy Roundtree, my mother's mother, was a survivor of the 1944 Hartford Circus fire. As sort of one of the few people who've written on that disaster noted, right after the Lions performed, people started seeing flames go up the side of the tent. These tents, of course, were soaked with gasoline and other flammables. And initially, people didn't understand what was going on, but when they saw the smoke, everybody started rushing towards the exit. My grandmother, who was from Florida, South Florida, North Florida, South Georgia, North Florida, I'm sorry, was traveling to Connecticut with a white family as a caretaker for their white child. And she was in the circus fire with this white child. And so when the fire broke out, instead of going to the exit, my grandmother began digging underneath the tent, a hole big enough to squeeze under and pull the child with her. She was never very vocal about this disaster. She never really wanted to talk about it. And there were a lot of questions that I always had about her in that particular moment. Did anyone help you in the immediate aftermath? Were you sitting in a segregated section? Were you seated in a section that was whites only because you had a white child with you? Did the Red Cross come? What are these sort of other variables that are part of this materiality of disaster and disaster relief? Officially, there's somewhere around 150 Red Cross deaths for the circus fire. But scholars and historians say that these circus fires or these circuses always brought with them a homeless element of people who sort of were attending these fires, and no one would have noticed their presence. Others have argued that the flames were so hot that some people were essentially cremated on site. There was always a large sort of homeless and sort of socioeconomic poor population around these events. So this idea that there were only 150 deaths is ridiculous, right? And this sort of speaks to some of these broader conversations and questions that we have. My grandmother suffered from nightmares for the rest of her life that we do know, which speaks to these sort of long-term questions of pain, but also of sort of psychological distress that then become part of chronic disease as well. So, as you know, there has been a ton of ink spilled on Hurricane Katrina, and my ink is part of that, right? Hurricane Katrina was a slow-moving, multi-generational disaster that was centuries in the making. And part of what I argue is that, thinking of Katrina, you must take into account sort of the long history of race and poverty in the region. Not just New Orleans. In the edited collection, which I was a part of, we made a point of not just focusing on New Orleans, that the Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Mississippi, parts of Alabama. All of these areas experienced devastation as well. But this area has traditionally high rates of kidney failure, of diabetes, of heart disease that you must take into account when thinking about this particular storm. But also, it's important for us to think about the immediate aftermath as well. One of the pieces that I wrote a couple of years ago, Hurricane Katrina, Diabetes and the Meaning of Resiliency, focuses on what the evacuation was like for people suffering from chronic diseases, in particular, diabetes. As I don't see her in the back anymore, but I think her name was Verlene Einstein. She made a point yesterday, which I thought was really good, which was that food is both a solution and a problem. And that was sort of precisely the problem in evacuation shelters in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. One of the bright spots, probably the only bright spot of Hurricane Katrina, was the activism from people from around the world through faith-based organizations, communities, organizations, cities. We sent a lot of canned goods into the Gulf Coast. The problem for people with diabetes was that it was high in salt, it was high in sodium, it was high in fat. And diabetes is unlike other chronic diseases in the fact that it is a disease of self-management and self-actualization, meaning that you have to take insulin on time, you have to eat on time, and you have to eat the right foods on time. Very difficult to do in an evacuation shelter when you are displaced. People lost their insulin, they lost the ability to manage their own diet, they lost the kind of insulin that they were supposed to take, they were unable to refrigerate insulin. And so these were sort of questions that needed to be addressed on a broad scale. For people with dialysis, they faced similar concerns. They went a number of days, if not weeks and months, without dialysis. In Tulane University Hospital, in the days leading up to Hurricane Katrina, they began calling people in early and sort of giving them extra sessions of dialysis. If you remember, Hurricane Katrina really struck on a Monday. By Monday afternoon, Tulane University Hospital lacked potable water, which is necessary to run dialysis. By Wednesday, they lost electricity, and by Friday, they had to evacuate to another shelter. We don't often think of dialysis as life support, but that's essentially what it is. And so these questions then of sort of resiliency and how we build resiliency are important. And if you do a Google search now, disasters in diabetes, disasters in epidemics, you'll see a groundswell through Google or Ovid or PubMed around this question of diabetes and disasters, particularly Katrina, which has sort of emerged in the last 15 to 20 years. And part of this was the Katrina effect, that it sort of reshaped or shifted our sort of thinking around chronic disasters. And so the other 2 points that I would make is that, or really the one point, is that it was sort of difficult to evacuate for some people suffering from diabetes. These stories emerge of people suffering from skin abrasions or skin breaks, which to someone who's not suffering from diabetes may or may not be an issue. But if you have diabetes and you have these skin abrasions and you're evacuating through these toxic filled waters, then that can become a dangerous complication. But also then sort of people who were just physically unable to evacuate. In this particular piece, I talk about individuals who want to evacuate to the Lake Pontchartrain Expressway, but sort of complained of their feet hurting or having to be pushed in a wheelchair and having to use the bathroom, but there was nowhere to go. These questions are very, very important for how we think about these things. And a course that I sometimes teach on Hurricane Katrina, we talk about the evacuation plan of New Orleans during Katrina, which was basically to get in your car and drive. And the evacuation plan of New Orleans now still really is to get into your car and drive. And so these questions then continue to shape how we think about these ideas. And so these are just a few images of sort of people and how we might think about this conversation around diabetes. There were some supplies that were shipped into the Gulf Coast. But again, without the adequate planning, much of this was delayed. And just to sort of talk a little bit about some of the testimony that you can pull out of this that sort of speaks to this broader issue of chronic disease. One testimony of a Katrina survivor wrote that on Tuesday evening, my neighbor Kip, a kidney transplant patient, waited home alone by flashlight from the convention center, where there were neither dialysis machines nor buses to get him to one. A nurse at the United Rehabilitation Hospital. Several diabetic patients had been without dialysis for nearly a week. After the fruit cocktail and peanut butter ran out, the staff broke into candy and drink machines for sugary items to keep patients from going into shock. These are people who are not going to make it. When I was sort of a grad student transitioning to a postdoc, and I was sort of working on some of these ideas, one of my colleagues, I don't remember who now, gave me an editorial from a newspaper in San Diego. And in this editorial was something that was really interesting, which said, somewhere in a cave, Osama bin Laden could get access to dialysis if he needed it. But in New Orleans, people are breaking into candy machines to stave off diabetic shock. And I thought that was a very telling piece about sort of the lack of planning and structure. So it's important also to remember that diabetes is, again, a disease that requires routine. And any type of sort of disruption to that routine can lead to problems. And what we see in the literature is that there are sort of elevated risk factors and sort of increased ER visits in the aftermath of disasters. Tropical Storm Iniki in '92, Andrew in '92, Hurricane Marilyn and Charlie in 2004. But also in the aftermath of, as I mentioned before, earthquakes. And part of this revolves around the idea that many of these people are undiagnosed until they come into an emergency room. And so once in the emergency room, they are long undiagnosed and sort of become visible for the first time. You see instances where people were assumed to be type 2 diabetic and were actually suffering from type 1 diabetes, which speaks to an entirely different narrative around this sort of increasing divide between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. But as I was writing this particular piece, in the backdrop was the recent government shutdown. And I was sort of thinking about this in 2020 when I was sort of writing this piece, and sort of the many different ways that people suffering from diabetes can be impacted by socioeconomic changes, disasters, but also disruptions as well. So the last two slides, when sort of thinking about what I was going to talk to you about today, I really sort of thought about this slide in terms of the panel and its sort of title in the path of disasters. And more recently, I've sort of really begun to think about when disasters collide, or what happens when disasters collide. Environmental disasters and sort of socioeconomic disasters, or sort of pandemics and environmental disasters. And so these are sort of some of the things that I'm sort of working on and thinking about now. In other contexts, I sort of talk about the chronicity, the ongoing disaster of something like the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. Things we think, or diseases we think are in the dustbin of history, actually are continuing in much the same way that we must think about Hurricane Katrina, not just as a 2005 event, but a long-standing multi-generational disaster. I tell people all the time that scientists have been working on coronaviruses since the 1980s, right? So there was this fear that there would be a zoonotic jump from animals to human beings since the 1980s, and various labs were working on that, which is interesting and important because this was also the era of AIDS, HIV/AIDS. So they thought enough about the dangers of this sort of emerging coronavirus that they would devote resources to this. And of course, our current SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is one of more recent sort of coronaviruses, including the 2002 SARS, pandemic as well as the 2012 MERS epidemic. But part of what I argue as well is that something like tuberculosis, right, which is still with us, right? Some 1.5 million people died from tuberculosis in 2018 alone. But in our mind, that's something that is something of the past. And so my argument is that when we think about something like COVID-2, it's not something that is going to end neatly for many people, but in many ways, it's just a continuation of longstanding sort of chronic disease and chronic illness. But also the importance of thinking about how these two disasters collide in other ways. As I sort of told my students the other day, part of the joy, but also the struggle of thinking about something like diabetes is that it's constantly evolving, and there's so many things about diabetes that we still do not know. For example, sort of scientists talking now about, the virus sort of enters into your body through these ACE2 receptors and sort of a lock and key factor. There's some scientists who are arguing that people with diabetes produce more of these ACE2 receptors in their pancreas and kidney. And so that makes people with sort of diabetes especially vulnerable, but also people with type 1 diabetes, it being essentially a B-cell autoimmune disease, makes it vulnerable because of stress as well. But also people suffering from type 2 diabetes also struggle with these questions of stress. So I think this is an important sort of corollary when thinking about this sort of broader idea of sort of foreseeable disasters, but also how disasters collide. And last slide, this is something that people suffering with diabetes will continue to have to deal with, right? Whether heat waves or forest fires or sort of just ordinary winter, these sort of competing disasters are part of these disruptions that demand routine, that demand policy, and that demand a vision for us to think about how to deal with this vulnerable population. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm so sorry for the technology, but I know now we'll be able to have a fabulous discussion. I'm just setting the mic, which is in front of you, and I know you're all going to be dazzled.
I'm so grateful for this presentation today, Professor Mizelle, for a variety of reasons, in particular the way in which you highlight the importance of us thinking about congruences, about environmental disasters alongside medical disasters, and also the real structural racism that underlies much of the conversation that you painted for us today. That a lot of the challenges that some of these communities are facing are ones that could have been prevented had different kinds of infrastructures been put in place. And that's the kind of tragic truth of your presentation today. I want to open the conversation with you now by actually starting where you began. I was really struck by you saying to us that chronic disease serves as a lens for us to think differently about history and really opens up and expands how we think about historical events. And so I wonder if you could share some more examples of that, about what it would mean to think about chronic disease as we're thinking about the history of the civil rights movement, or what does it mean to think about chronic disease as a lens for us reinterpreting a particular world war. Because I think that that's a lens that is often not offered up as a vehicle for us to better understand our histories. And I'm really struck by that and what it can illuminate for us, particularly in terms of Black and Brown communities.
Thank you so much for that question. So I am among a cohort of scholars who sort of write about chronic disease now, but also thinking about how disease is used to create race. Right, so part of the history of diabetes is in some ways how it crosses the color line. Diabetes was considered to be a disease of whiteness in the early 20th century, a disease of civilization. In fact, it was actually considered to be a disease of Jewishness, a Judenkrankheit, that only sort of sensitive, civilized populations could suffer from diabetes. And so the argument was that African Americans were not biologically evolved or creative or sensitive or artistic enough to suffer from this particular disease. Jews, on the other hand, they argued were sort of in this middling stage and sort of evolving to the point where their proximity to, they couldn't be white, but their proximity to whiteness might make them vulnerable to diabetes. So in some ways, my project sort of narrates this idea of ignorance making. My argument is not around diabetes, that Black people suffer from diabetes too. That much is obvious. I can sort of bring out tons of information about that. But what is the project of ignorance making and sort of what we call agnotology, or the unmaking of knowledge, that makes the hiding of this information important for the creation of race? And so when you get to sort of the civil rights movement, and or even World War II before that, you start to see these narratives shift for a number of political, social, cultural reasons, as sort of certain immigrant groups began to shift into different categories, and as African Americans begin to migrate from the South to the North, and that's part of this chapter 2, maybe chapter 1. But I argue, as well as a few other scholars, that the Great Migration is remarkably under-theorized in terms of sort of chronic disease and public health. So similar to immigrants coming to the country, African Americans migrate to Baltimore, New York, sort of brought them into a surveillance and visibility where it's not that sort of public health officials said, "Oh, this is something we didn't anticipate." They knew that Black people were suffering from diabetes in the past, but now they were forced to acknowledge it and deal with it in a certain way. And so, diabetes and other chronic diseases, asthma, cancer, it follows a similar trajectory. And so the civil rights movement through the Medical Committee for Human Rights, the Black Panther Party, which is known for its environmental activism around lead and lead poisoning, they were also very active with diabetes as well. But even other civil rights organizations like the SCLC occasionally sort of touched upon this issue of diabetes in their literature. And so you see this particular disease as sort of a force pushing change. And as my advisor sort of talked about with cancer, you see how cancer literally crosses the color line. And so I'm doing something similar with diabetes, and it sort of shows the ways in which society is changing, but also how disease is forcing change in various lenses and various avenues.
And this is extraordinary. I mean, there's so much that you've said that's actually demands a kind of reattention on our part, particularly as you talked about the necessity of cultivating an archive, and you just described the kind of willful ignorance that is part of the reasons why it might have been challenging to find a material record of illness outside of the cultural productions of blues performers or someone like Richard Wright. And so I wonder, before I ask you about Richard Wright, because I'm really curious about Richard Wright as an English professor, I always want to know more about Wright in particular, but I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more with us about this moment in your presentation when you spoke to the racialized differentials in the tabulation of deaths in the aftermath of a disaster. So can you explain to us a little bit about how and why it is possible to miscount, particularly in this age that we're in? We're not talking about, the early 20th century or the 19th century, we're talking about Katrina, right? How would it be possible to miscount deaths? Or even today, I don't know if you're seeing the same kind of phenomenon happening in the wake of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as some of our other colleagues have sort of spoken about in the last couple of days, there's willful ignorance around that as well, in terms of sort of the refusal to see Black and brown bodies. And, I build on, sort of a lot of scholars who sort of write about this. Marissa Fuentes, in her book on enslaved women in Barbados, talking about fugitive knowledge that, Black women in Barbados encountered violence both at the time, but also in the historical archive as well. And, this is part of what we describe as the ideological archive. It doesn't have to be this way. Like I sort of looked at tons and tons of oral histories on the 1927 flood. And, they made conscious decisions not to include Black survivors of the 1927 flood when these records were being recorded in the 1940s and 1950s. And so, that's part of sort of thinking about this broader narrative as well. There were a lot of people writing in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. I remember sort of being fascinated by criminologists who were talking about Katrina time. And their concept of Katrina time was really revolved around mostly poor Black and brown people who were incarcerated for petty crimes, but as a result of Hurricane Katrina, stayed incarcerated for years in the aftermath of the disaster while the jails and criminal justice system was being rebuilt. But there's another way you can sort of apply that theory of Katrina time to chronic disease, right? What are some of the long-term impacts of missed dialysis, of sort of stress that are not easily quantifiable in the immediacy of a disaster, but might take 4, 5, 10 years to accumulate and result in death. These are things that are not being counted, and you see this in oral histories throughout the country. People say, well, my uncle didn't die from Katrina, but he died of Katrina, right? I do a lot with displacement. A lot of my work revolves around movement, physical movement, but also feelings of displacement. In Katrina, after Katrina, what did it mean for the fish shop that you went to as a kid to no longer be there, to lose your family Bible, to lose your grandmother's house that you grew up in, right? These things sort of take its toll on your bodies. And I also deal quite a bit with stress, as a result of thinking about diabetes, but also in some of my other work, thinking about the impact of stress on Black women's bodies and resulting in poor birth outcomes. So how we think about this accumulation of stress in different places and how we sort of need a broader infrastructure to count deaths and pain is part of what's required.
So to continue this conversation, because this is really crucial. I mean, many of us saw the New York Times article about Black women's infant maternity and infant mortality, right? Mm-hmm. And how those death rates for Black women's children are the same as they were during slavery, if not even worse, slightly worse. And so you're helping us to have further insight into why this problem and the structural challenges at play that make this a true and continuing crisis. But at another level, you started to talk about the sort of multi-general dimensions of chronic disease. So you've helped us have a sense of the sort of long-term consequences that we can track from a natural disaster on the human body of someone suffering from chronic illness. Can we talk about what that means for their larger family dynamics, right? So how is this creating real stress and strain within families?
Well, no, that's a really good question, and that's part of the narrative of diabetes, right? In the aftermath of Katrina, but also in the 1920s, right? When you have chronic disease, which is one of the reasons why it's so interesting, it makes it different from other kinds of diseases. It's not just you suffering, but it's your family, right? It's within sort of patient records. You can see, sort of siblings complaining about their other siblings who are suffering from diabetes and not being able to eat certain foods because their sibling, brother or sister, is suffering from diabetes, or having to bend to the clock. And this is sort of a piece of sort of a chronic disease that I bring up in pieces called Diabetes, Race, and Amputations, which I published in The Lancet last year. But African Americans are 4 times more likely to suffer an unnecessary amputation from peripheral arterial disease. And so the result of that is that the people who are caring for them also have to sort of sacrifice to care for them. And so that then becomes an important part of the narrative as well.
To that point, you brought up the term resilience and resiliency, and it has become almost a kind of catchword, particularly in this last 2 years around COVID. And particularly for Black and brown communities suffering under the strain of COVID, which is both a medical health emergency as well as a socioeconomic emergency, and so forth. Can you talk a little bit more about what resilience means as we talk about the fact that we know that we can predict, not with a date certainty necessarily, but that there's going to be an increased frequency and number and intensity to natural disasters as we go forward in time? And so what does it mean to talk about the term resiliency for these communities suffering under chronic illness who bear a disproportionate impact from these natural disasters?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as public health scholar David Williams wrote, how everything is health policy, right? So housing policy is health policy. Sort of spatial orientation of supermarkets is health policy. Sort of where you can run is health policy. And I was sort of pleased and happy sort of this conversation that was occurring earlier. When I was trained as a historian, it was sort of, environmental history over here, John, David Thoreau and Henry, Muir over here, and then environmental justice movements over here, right? Love Canal and Warren County, but the two were not sort of separate. So, I do think that we have to sort of think about where people live and sort of think about some of the broader conversations of how people are unable to escape environmental toxins. I mean, I do work around lead poisoning and sort of how we have known of the dangers of lead poisoning for 100 years, but we are still, for many of us, living in the midst of lead and lead poisoning. So I think that it requires more than sort of an honest conversation at this point, quite frankly. I think some more sort of strong-handed demands, around sort of these things that are sort of causing stress in people's lives. And I keep bringing up stress, but it's such an important piece that it's invisible and very difficult for us to see. But it's in many ways the cause of diabetes. It can be the cause of cancer. It can be the cause of these sort of myriad numbers of sort of chronic diseases in our lifestyle. Sort of understanding what it means to not own an automobile and how not owning an automobile can sort of limit you in the jobs that you get, or sort of the poverty tax of having to pay more in certain neighborhoods, right? All of these things are things that I know and but somehow it doesn't make its way to policy. And I'm not there yet, but as a sort of solidly mid-career scholar now, I'm trying to become more active. So, and sort of more politically engaged, because these questions around diabetes that I know, that I write and other people read, and I'm glad you read it and I hope you read it, but I want to be able to write something that can sort of lead to a tangible or a significant change.
This is, I think, part of the wonderful richness of this occasion, where we have in our midst and in conversation and dialogue with us, community advocates and people who are invested in these questions in the same way that you are, because you're right. I mean, this is really a health policy emergency that needs to be addressed in order to sort of rise to these challenges and stave off what we know are an inevitable set of deaths that are on the horizon if we do not.
Can I add one more thing?
Please do.
Yeah, I was at a sort of panel a couple of years ago talking about some community gardens, and a guy made what I thought was an interesting point. It was like, you can't grow enough food in a community garden to feed the amount of people that you need, but community gardens are about a sort of mindset, which is sort of showing people the importance of healthy living and what eating healthy can do for you and how it can help you to alleviate obesity and chronic disease. But there's sort of an invisibility to sort of obesity and chronic disease that we have to continue to talk about. And sort of part of that invisibility, can be epidemic in a number of different ways. For example, there's an epidemic of diabetes among Asian populations, right? And people assume that Asians are skinny or not normally obese, so they say, so they don't suffer from diabetes, and that's not the case. There are a number of reasons why people suffer from diabetes and different kinds of obesity that manifests itself in the body.
I hate to avert this conversation about policy questions, because that really, I think, is where we need to maintain pressure. But out of my own sort of greedy investment, and as the last question that I'll ask before I turn it to the audience with us today, can you share more about the insights that Richard Wright offered on the 1927 flood, and what was intriguing to you about his chronicling of those events?
So, when I was on sort of the traveling circuit for the 27th flood, people used to always ask me, well, was Richard Wright there, or were the blues musicians there? Like, no, the blues musicians were in New York. They were in Chicago, recording these songs in the 1930s. But the blues and Richard Wright sort of, for me, defined a sociology of knowledge, right? Of sort of creating a narrative that was representative and sort of understandable for a number of Black people in a number of different places. keeping in mind that this was the era of the Great Migration. So Richard Wright, of course, is from Mississippi and migrated to Memphis and was likely in Memphis when the 27th flood occurs, and then he goes to Chicago. And that is where he writes the two flood stories, Down by the Riverside and The Man Who Cried, I Am. Down by the Riverside, almost to a T, sort of correlates with other archival sources on the Mound Bayou Levee crevice, particularly how African-American men were forced into peonage by gunpoint that John Berry, Pete Daniel, Robert Spencer, and myself all talk about. And so he chronicles this in a novel, 50 years before any historian does, right? So, so he's clearly sort of, listening like blues musicians to sort of broader knowledge that's being circulated throughout the country in the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, word of mouth. And from that, he is sort of creating a narrative about this. And so, these two pieces, I've always sort of thought about, those two pieces with, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and, that particular piece around the 1928 Lake Okeechobee hurricane. And the great Cheryl Wall at Rutgers sort of helped me to sort of think through some of these ideas of historical fiction, literature, and disasters, rest of soul. And so, I began to sort of think about, how blues and how historical fiction can sort of tell us what other archives do not. During the Civil Rights era, The Man Who Cried, I Am is sort of a chronicle of sort of civil rights and sort of pain. Was he suffering from the pain of cancer or the pain of the civil rights movement? I want to ask you afterwards if you have any sort of insight on novels that deal with diabetes. I know of one, but anything else you can help me with, that would be great. So it's just an opportunity. And I'm a historian, I'm trained as a historian, but I've always said that historians need to start seeing other people.
Well, on that note, I need to stop being so selfish and be the only one asking questions of Dr. Mizelle. I'd like to open it up to the floor. Please share your questions.
So yeah, we have about 7 minutes, so plenty of time for 2 questions, I would say, 2 good questions. So in the chat, if you are also on Zoom, I will be monitoring the chat if you want to write your question in the chat. So,
Luis,
yes.
please.
Yes. Am my voice here for me, or I should go front? Sorry. As myself, I'm interested in culture, and I'm interested in the visuality of the disaster archive. This is how people see and represent disaster. So I was struck by the title of one of your pieces, Making Race Visible with a Disaster Archive. It immediately picked into my own interest. So, and I know it's a topic that is recurrent in the bibliography from fan to phanologics, like the topic of seeing race is crucial. But I would like to know if in your archive, I know you work with music and perhaps a different kind of archive, but if you saw in the archive that racialization of the images, of the how is the archive racialized, the visual archive?
Yeah, the very first slide on my PowerPoint, that was, image of sort of flood survivors on the Greenville, Mississippi levee. And so that's sort of one of the ways in which, race becomes visual or visible in the archive. But also the ways in which these sort of images were taken. Many of them were taken by the Coast Guard or the U.S. Army, and that in and of itself is sort of politicized in a certain way. The ways in which certain photographs sort of key in on sort of the landscape, which is why I showed that one image of sort of the muddy landscape with sort of a few sort of tents. That to me sort of speaks to this sort of broader narrative of visualizing the archive, why certain images are taken and for what reason. I think all of that is important. One really good photo that I saw in an archive, which was mounted on the wall, and they wouldn't let me have it. And the book was close to coming out anyway, so I couldn't wait because I needed to get tenure. But there was an image that they had literally just found in somebody's basement. Like somebody had died, and daughter or son brought this image, and it was of the Mound Bayou levee break. And you can clearly see on the sides of the levee Black bodies in stretchers or laying out on the ground. And keeping in mind the official tally of the 1927 flood by the American Red Cross is roughly 200 people. There were easily 150 people on this levee in this particular image, in that one particular image. So that sort of shows the ways in which the disaster was documented in a certain way, but rendered invisible for sort of political and social purposes. So there are a number of ways that you can sort of use sort of visualization, I think, to help create a narrative of the past.
Yeah, thank you. Your talk was fascinating, and it's got me wondering on how we delineate the timing, like the time period in which we understand a disaster. It seems that, and I'd like to hear more how you picture your work on chronic disease, this kind of long aftermath of the disaster. When does it make sense to say the 27th flood ended? When does it make sense to say Katrina ended? Because from the state's standpoint, from business's standpoint, the goal is always the disaster ends as fast as possible, we recover, we reboot. And that seems to me to miss a lot, and the chronic disease lens you look through seems to really push against that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, a good question. I mean, this is sort of part of what we're going through now, right? Environmental historians of medicine are now talking about this idea of when does the pandemic end? Well, we hate to be the ones to tell you, but it won't, right? This is going to be with us for the foreseeable future, if not forever. For some people, it might end in a year or 6 months, but for others, it will just be a continuation of the disaster they have already been experiencing, right? So people as one scholar was writing about HIV in Kenya, so these sort of unmarked graves and bodies that you saw in nursing homes in the aftermath of, or during our current COVID pandemic, reminded them of the early years of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Kenya. So for them, it was a continuation of that, right? So for the 1927 flood, and it's a good question. I ask people asking me all the time, why is the 27 flood not remembered? And part of it is because it was such a broad disaster. It impacted 7 states, from Illinois down to the Gulf of Mexico. There sometimes were not these visually fantastic images of other disasters, but also because it sort of moved into the 1928 Flood Control Act and moved into sort of the levee camps in the 1930s. And so there was not a clear break, right? We have, rehabilitated our land. It sort of spilled over like the levee and the river into sort of various decades, even more, some would argue to the 1930s and 1940s. So I think it's important for us to sort of trouble that sort of clear dividing point of disasters and talk about sort of the long-term chronicity of both pandemics, epidemics, and environmental disasters.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really hate to have to cut such a wonderful conversation. So thanks again for such a compelling presentation and for the discussion that followed that brought up so many questions, right, that I would encourage you to continue and be during the break with everybody. So again, let's give a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I hope you will join us for the last session at 4, where we'll be discussing a documentary about Cuba and disasters. So this will be the last session of the day. Thank you. See you in 30 minutes.